In April 2019, on a seemingly ordinary day in Chicago, Marlon Ochoa Lopez, a 19-year-old pregnant woman, eagerly awaited the birth of her baby. 9 months pregnant and full of maternal anticipation, Marlon connected with a woman on a Facebook group for mothers, drawn by an offer that seemed too kind to refuse. The woman, a stranger from the internet, had offered Marlon free baby clothes and a stroller, an act of generosity that resonated with Marlon's current needs. The arrangement led Marlon to schedule a meeting to pick up the items. With hopes high and her family unaware of the risks, she left her home that day, stepping into a situation fraught with unknown danger. As the hours ticked by, Marlon did not return and her phone went silent. Her family's worry escalated with each unreturned call, each passing moment leading to an increasingly dire situation. Unknown to them at the time, this meeting was not just a simple exchange of goods, but the beginning of a heartbreaking mystery. Marlon Ochoa Lopez was a 19-year-old Latina mother who was nearly 9 months pregnant with a second child. She went missing on April 23, 2019, in a southwestern suburb of Chicago, United States. The last time she was seen was as she was leaving her school. She was expected to give birth on May 5th and was supposed to pick up her 3-year-old son from daycare, but she never showed up. On the morning of her disappearance, at around 10:40 a.m., Marlon texted her husband, saying that she was not feeling well and thought labor might be starting soon. By 6 p.m., Giovanni called his mother-in-law to ask about Marlon's whereabouts because the daycare had called to say no one came to pick up their son. The family initially thought that Marlon might have gone into labor, so her mother and stepfather began calling various hospitals and even visited some in hopes of finding her, but they were unsuccessful. Her mother and husband tried to reach her multiple times through text, but she did not respond. That night, her family went to a Chicago police station to report her missing. The officers there told them they had to wait 24 hours before filing a missing persons report. The next day, on April 24th, they returned to file the report. No immediate alert was issued. They were told that only the husband could file the report. Giovanni subsequently filed the report, but the police did not publicize it until 2 days later. On April 25th, the family received news that a patient with Marlon's name had been admitted for a cesarean section at a hospital. However, upon arriving, they were informed that it had been a mix-up with another patient's name. The family continued to call and visit hospitals in the hope that Marlon was somehow giving birth. At this point, they ruled out the possibility that she had been kidnapped as there had been no ransom calls. Members of Marlon's family and their friends took to social media to seek help. The first clue came when some people sent screenshots to Marlon's mother, Raquel, showing a Facebook mothers group Marlon had recently joined and posted in. Nothing suspicious was found, but all this information was handed over to detectives investigating the case. On the morning of the next day, family members received a call from someone claiming to be part of a cartel. The caller said they had Marlon and had taken her to Mexico, demanding $1,000 for her release before hanging up. The family feared the worst and immediately reported this to the police. Authorities suspected it was likely a scam given the low amount of money requested. Due to the lack of progress in the case, the police finally decided to issue a high-risk missing person alert 72 hours after Marlon's disappearance was initially reported. In the alert, it was mentioned that Marlon Ochoa was 9 months pregnant and was last seen leaving her school. She was last seen wearing gray sweatpants and a maroon blouse with her school's logo. By April 28th, flyers began to circulate throughout the neighborhood, and police started questioning family and friends, including her husband Giovanni, as Marlon's parents suspected he might be involved. Days went by without any leads on her whereabouts, only further steps from people who claimed to have seen her. In desperation and with the lack of progress from the police, the family hired a private investigator who spoke Spanish for 35 hours of work. A press conference was held on May 2nd where her parents pleaded for her safe return, suspecting she might be held against her will. Julia, a former school social worker, mentioned during the conference that investigators should look into Marlon's Facebook group interactions, particularly with a person named Clarissa Figueroa. May 5th, Marlon's due date came and went without any information about her whereabouts. There were suspicions that someone was holding her captive until she gave birth. Hope remained that she would be found. 2 days later, the police began to scrutinize screenshots of Facebook conversations between Marlon and Clarissa Figueroa. They discovered that Marlon had agreed to meet with Clarissa on the day she disappeared to pick up baby clothes and supplies. The police then traced this to an address in Chicago, Illinois. When detectives arrived at the location, they were met by Clarissa's daughter, Desiree, who told them that her mother was not home and had recently given birth. The detectives left, but on a nearby street, they found Marlon's Honda Civic parked half a block away from Clarissa's home. The family was notified of this discovery the next day. In another development, Marlon's mother received news that a newborn baby had been found in an alley in the northwest part of the city and was taken to a hospital. They immediately thought it could be Marlon's baby and hoped she was still alive. However, their hopes were short-lived when a detective called the next day to inform them that the baby found was not Marlon's, as the DNA did not match her husband's. Amid the false leads, a man claimed to have seen Marlon begging for money on a street in the center of Chicago. However, when they went there, they found no one, even after combing through the streets. While the family continued their search, Chicago police visited Clarissa Figueroa at the hospital where she claimed to have given birth. The hospital records did show a baby admitted that day, but the infant was in intensive care with no brain activity. Incredibly, the police did not investigate further and took Clarissa's word that she had given birth, even though she showed no physical signs of having recently delivered a baby. The hospital social worker also failed to question her further. By May 9th, a walk was organized to distribute flyers in the area where Marlon's car had been found. Meanwhile, the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services was alerted about suspicions surrounding Clarissa's newborn and took the baby into protective custody. That afternoon, Giovanni Lopez, Marlon's husband, underwent a DNA test to determine if he was the father. Saliva samples were taken from the infant, and hair samples were taken from Marlon's husband for comparison. Despite the lack of progress and communication from the police, an anonymous person contacted the family the next day. This person claimed to have seen Marlon enter Figueroa's home on the day she disappeared and provided the address. When the family relayed this to the police, they were told that without a court-approved warrant, they could not enter the property. On May 12th, further clues emerged in the form of screenshots from a GoFundMe page, apparently set up by the Figueroas to raise money for the newborn, who was on life support. However, due to many previous false leads, the family did not initially pay much attention to this. What they did not know was that they would soon find the answers they had been desperately seeking. It was then that they received the DNA test results, which confirmed that the baby's father was Giovanni Lopez. The Department of Children and Family Services granted custody of the child. While they were relieved to know this, the question remained, where was Marlon? They would find out on May 14, 2019, after providing all the clues to the police and learning that the DNA indeed matched. They obtained a search warrant to enter the Figueroa family's home. Upon arrival, they found Clarissa Figueroa's boyfriend cleaning a carpet with bleach and a hose. He immediately dropped the hose and went inside when he saw the officers. They informed him they had a warrant to search the property in connection to Clarissa Figueroa's alleged involvement in Marlon Ochoa's case. He did not resist and let them in. Inside, they found Clarissa Figueroa and her daughter Desiree. The officers noticed some bloodstains and cleaning supplies, but initially, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. However, their attention was caught by a trash can in the corner of the backyard. Upon lifting the lid, they made a gruesome discovery: a woman's body with a cable around her neck and a cross-shaped wound on her abdomen, showing signs of having been pregnant. After the discovery, the family was informed that something terrible had been found and that they needed to be strong. The identity wasn't confirmed yet, so they couldn't say for sure it was Marlon. Initially, the family hoped she might be alive but in grave condition, as they were not informed about the state of the body. All 3 people inside the house were arrested as primary suspects. The body was taken to the county medical examiner's office, which after 15 hours confirmed that it was indeed Marlon Ochoa, and the cause of death was strangulation. Marlon's father expressed that they had come to this country to give their daughter a good life, and unfortunately, there are bad people everywhere. He also emphasized that Marlon had a bright future ahead and was continuing her education to provide a better life for her children. On May 17th, the primary suspects were brought to court. Clarissa Figueroa, 46, Desiree Figueroa, 24, and Piotr Bobak, 40, all pleaded not guilty to the charges. However, the evidence was overwhelming and a 911 call helped reconstruct the entire crime. The tragedy started when Clarissa Figueroa lost her 20-year-old son in 2017 and couldn't cope with his loss. She then began entertaining the idea of having another child. Towards the end of 2018, Clarissa Figueroa began to fake a pregnancy. She posted ultrasounds and pictures of a future baby room on social media and even showed her family an ultrasound that she had taken from the internet. Her daughter Desiree was surprised by this behavior, especially since her 46-year-old mother could no longer have children due to a tubal ligation years prior. Clarissa even confessed to her daughter that she would become a mother again, even if it meant killing for it. Months later, Desiree also became pregnant, and Clarissa decided it was time to have a baby so they could both raise their children together. Clarissa announced her fake pregnancy and joined a Facebook group for expectant mothers. Before Marlon Ochoa disappeared, she posted on Facebook in a group called Help a Sister Out, saying that she needed a double stroller for her 3-year-old and her unborn child. She was willing to buy, trade, or simply accept a donation as she was unemployed at the time. Clarissa responded to her post, offering new baby clothes and other items. On the night of April 23, 2019, Marlon arrived at Clarissa's house in southwest Chicago. She had just left school and drove there. Once inside and seated on the sofa, Clarissa told her to wait while she and Desiree went to fetch the clothes. As Marlon waited, the women went to the kitchen and initiated their terrible plan. Desiree distracted Marlon with photos of Clarissa's deceased son. Clarissa then used a coaxial cable to strangle Marlon. Despite Marlon's resistance, Clarissa overpowered her and yelled at her daughter for not doing her part correctly. After Marlon stopped breathing, Clarissa went to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, a plastic bag, and a blanket. They proceeded to cut open Marlon's abdomen in a cross shape to extract the baby. They cut the umbilical cord and removed the placenta, but the baby was not breathing. In desperation, Clarissa called 911, falsely claiming she had just given birth at home, and that the baby was not breathing. She started performing CPR as instructed until the paramedics arrived. The paramedics arrived, and the baby was taken to a hospital with severe brain damage. Hospital staff found it strange that Clarissa showed no signs of having given birth, but didn't question her at the time. Clarissa continued to pose as the baby's mother, even starting a GoFundMe campaign for donations. They named the baby Sander, although his real name was Giovanni Hadiel Lopez. Tragically, he died on June 14, 2019, due to brain death caused by oxygen and blood deprivation. Clarissa Figueroa and her daughter were charged with Marlon Ochoa's murder, while Clarissa's boyfriend was charged with covering up the crime. The family of Marlon expressed outrage at the hospital for not raising questions sooner and felt discriminated against due to their undocumented status. Marlon and her family were originally from Puebla, Mexico. Marlon was born on November 16, 1999, and had moved to the United States when she was 2 years old with her family's hope of a better life, a dream that ended in tragedy. Well, that is the end of today's case. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Unreal True Crime. If you found this episode informative, please consider subscribing and activating the notification bell so you won't miss future episodes. Thank you for watching and take care. The Story of Stacy Pannell. Stacy Pannell was born on September 5, 1967, in the small American town of Ripley, Mississippi. She had a younger brother and sister with whom she spent a lot of time and got along well with. Stacy was an energetic person with many friends. In school, she enjoyed participating in extracurricular activities. She joined the marching band, where she played a decorative wooden rifle. After graduating from high school in 1985, she attended Northeast Mississippi Community College in Boonville. Although it was about a 30-minute drive from her home, she decided to live in the dormitory. From the first days of college, Stacy was thrilled, made many friends, and joined the local marching band. On October 7, 1985, Stacy attended a training session after school, met up with her boyfriend, and went to a party on campus. At 12:30 a.m., she returned to the dormitory with her friends. They chatted for a bit, and then she went to sleep. At around 2:30 a.m., her roommate, Amy Wheeler, returned to the dormitory after the party but had lost her keys and had to knock on the door. The room was designed for 2 people, so only Stacy could open the door. However, there was no response to the knocking. Amy waited there for a few minutes before deciding to knock on the adjacent room's door. The dormitory was designed such that there was a common bathroom between the 2 rooms, so Amy could go through the bathroom of the adjacent room. A student named Stephanie Alexander lived in that room, who woke up to the knocking and opened the door. Both girls were surprised that Stacy did not respond to the knocking, so they entered her room together. The room was completely dark, and the only light came from a very dim lamp. Amy entered the room and saw Stacy lying on her bed, but one of her legs was hanging down, and she felt that something was not right with her friend. Getting closer, she was horrified to see blood on the bed. After recovering from the shock, she ran out of the room to get help. Other students responded to her screams, and the dormitory guard called 911. The police arrived and found an alarming scene. Stacy was dead, and there were traces of blood all over the room. There was a pillow over her face, and her underwear was pulled down. The investigators also noticed that someone had cut the mosquito netting of the window. Next to the bed, they found a wooden rifle that Stacy had used in parades with the marching band. It was covered in blood and wrapped in a towel. The police assumed the rifle had been used in the murder. Upon examining the crime scene more closely, forensic experts found a short hair on the victim's bed. All this was enough to form a preliminary picture of what had happened. Someone had made a hole in the window of Stacy's room, climbed in, raped, and murdered her. However, this version of events quickly revealed some inconsistencies. The size of the hole in the mosquito netting was too small for an adult to pass through. The window in question was situated at a certain height from the ground, which would have made the perpetrator's task more difficult. The police did not find the cut piece of the mosquito netting either. Furthermore, forensic experts examined the victim's body and found no traces of male biological material, casting doubt on the theory that the victim had been raped. At the same time, the pathologist confirmed that the wooden rifle, with a high degree of probability, was the murder weapon, as the injury characteristics indicated that the victim had been struck multiple times with it. Experts also did not find any defensive wounds on her body, suggesting that the victim did not resist the attacker. All possible evidence from Stacy's room was collected by crime scene investigators, but none of it furthered the investigation. At the time, DNA analysis was not commonly used, so the investigators could not examine the blood samples or other potential biological traces. Additionally, no fingerprints were found on the murder weapon, as the perpetrator had apparently wiped it clean with the towel. Despite the lack of leads, detectives still hoped that experts might find something in the room, so they decided to take fingerprints from all individuals who theoretically could have entered the women's dormitory. This task proved to be very difficult, as the police had to speak with hundreds of male university students and ask them to volunteer their fingerprints. They also took prints from all male staff members. The problem was that only girls lived in this residence, and a special key was needed to enter the building. Men could only enter in a few instances, such as being let in by residents or being college employees with a key. Nevertheless, the female residents frequently invited their boyfriends and male friends, which meant that the officers had to spend a lot of time collecting their fingerprints. However, in the end, this led to no results since no matching prints were found at the crime scene. With no leads, the investigators turned to a psychologist and asked for a psychological profile of the killer. After reviewing all the available information, the specialist posited that the attacker was likely a man between 20 and 24 years old with a strong physical build and no criminal record. The psychologist believed that the crime was not premeditated. The killer saw an opportunity and decided to attack the victim. This description made the officers further doubt that the criminal had entered the room through the window, as the hole in the mosquito netting was too small for a large, adult man to pass through. Meanwhile, panic spread among the college students. The female students were afraid to be in their residences, fearing they could become the next victim of the unknown assailant. The fact that the police could not find any clues only heightened the overall anxiety. The officers continued to search for possible suspects and decided to investigate Stacy's boyfriend, Tommy Osborne. They searched his room in the residence and found nothing to suggest his involvement. Investigators found it impossible to establish whether Stacy Pannell's boyfriend, Tommy Osborne, had any motive for her murder. According to Stacy's friends, the couple rarely argued and had no significant issues. However, the investigators learned from Stacy's parents that before starting college, she had another boyfriend named Ben with whom she had broken up just a few months earlier. Ben and Stacy had been in a long-term relationship during school, and he had even given her a ring, hoping to marry her in the future. But Stacy ended the relationship, and despite Ben's reluctance to accept the breakup and his refusal to take the ring back, Stacy did not change her decision. Up until Stacy left for college, Ben repeatedly tried to meet with her, but she remained firm in her decision. The detective spoke with Ben, who claimed that on the night of the murder, he was asleep at home. His mother corroborated his alibi, stating that he went to bed around 11 p.m. and was home the next morning. However, the investigators considered the possibility that Ben could have left the house undetected, gone to Stacy's college, committed the murder, and then returned home. Ben agreed to undergo a polygraph test, but the results were inconclusive. The operator could not determine if he was telling the truth. A second interrogation yielded the same results. This made the detectives suspicious, but without concrete evidence, they could not link him to the crime. Experts attempted to determine if the hair found on Stacy's bed belonged to Ben, but they were unable to reach a definitive conclusion. Since DNA analysis was not commonly used at that time to confirm or refute such evidence, it was not possible to do so. Due to the uncertain polygraph results, Ben became the prime suspect in the case, but Stacy's relatives did not believe he was capable of harming her. They described him as kind and well-mannered, always taking care of her. However, without evidence, the police could not charge him, and the search for clues continued. Later on, the investigators re-examined the case materials and noticed something peculiar. When examining the cut in the mosquito netting, they observed that the fibers were directed towards the outside rather than inside, indicating that the piece had been cut from within Stacy's room, not from outside. This discovery further puzzled the detectives. If the killer did not enter through the window, he must have had a key or entered with one of the residents. However, the police doubted this was possible since there was a guard in the dormitory who sat near the entrance and watched everyone who came in and out. For several months, there were no significant developments in the case. Then, the lead detective decided to seek assistance from Steve Rhodes, the sheriff of Illinois, who was well known in law enforcement circles for his unique approach to interrogations based on neuro-linguistic programming. He frequently spoke at police seminars and had a reputation for being able to extract information from almost any suspect and detect lies. Steve agreed to interrogate 4 people involved in the case: Stacy's neighbors Amy and Stephanie, as well as Ben and Tommy. In September 1986, he began his work, starting with Amy. She recounted everything she knew, and the officer found no reason to doubt her words. He then spoke with Stephanie, who said that on the night in question, she took an anti-inflammatory medication prescribed by a doctor and went to sleep. At around 12:30 a.m., Stephanie heard Stacy and her friends returning to the dormitory and talking loudly in Stacy's room. Stephanie went to ask them to speak more quietly. After her request, Stacy's friends left for their rooms, and Stephanie went to bed. However, Steve Rhodes, an experienced investigator, sensed that Stephanie was withholding important details. He accused her of lying and urged her to tell the truth. Despite Stephanie's insistence that she was not deceiving him, Rhodes continued to press her with questions until she finally revealed that she had returned to Stacy's room after the friends had left. This was a shocking development for the detectives, nearly a year after the murder. After a long pause during the questioning, Stephanie, to everyone's surprise, confessed that she had killed Stacy. According to Stephanie, she had entered Stacy's room for a chat. At some point, the conversation turned to Tommy Osborne, Stacy's boyfriend. Stephanie complimented Tommy, which upset Stacy. When Stacy demanded that Stephanie stay away from Tommy, the conversation escalated. After an exchange of words, Stacy slapped Stephanie, who retaliated in kind. The altercation became physical, and at some point Stephanie grabbed a wooden rifle next to the bed and struck Stacy, causing her to fall onto the bed. Stephanie then hit Stacy several times more until she stopped moving. Realizing what she had done after seeing the blood, Stephanie panicked and decided to dispose of the evidence. She locked the bedroom door, washed the blood off her hands, and then staged the scene to make it look as if someone had broken into the room, raped, and killed Stacy. She placed a pillow over Stacy's head, pulled down her underwear, and then cut a hole in the mosquito netting, hiding it in Stacy's closet under a pile of clothes. She cleaned the wooden rifle with a towel and took a shower to remove any traces of blood. Stephanie then decided to get rid of her t-shirt and the piece of mosquito netting she had cut. She locked herself in the bathroom and burned them to mask the smell of smoke by spraying a large amount of perfume. After covering her tracks, Stephanie went to bed and was only awakened when Amy knocked on her door. The detectives were astonished by this confession. For a whole year, it had never occurred to them that the killer could be a woman, let alone Stacy's dormitory neighbor. Stephanie was arrested and charged with Stacy's murder. 3 days later, she wrote a letter to her boyfriend, whom she had been dating for a week at the university, detailing the events and claiming it was an accident. She wrote that on the day of the murder, she had taken some energy pills and was not thinking clearly. She didn't even remember the moment of the murder, but had seen it in nightmares throughout the year. Days after sending the letter, the case took another unexpected turn. Stephanie claimed that Steve Rhodes had put her in some sort of trance using his techniques and had implanted the confession in her mind. She insisted she couldn't have killed Stacy and accused the police of taking advantage of her vulnerable state to close the case. According to her, the energy pills clouded her mind, allowing Steve Rhodes to convince her over time that she had indeed killed her neighbor. In 1987, a judge held 3-day hearings to determine the truth of her statements. The detectives asserted that Stephanie had not been subjected to any undue pressure and that no one had hypnotized her. They argued that in her confession, she mentioned details only the murderer could know, such as where she hid the knife used to cut the mosquito netting. The detectives hadn't found it during their initial investigation, but after Stephanie's confession, they found the knife in the closet under a pile of clothes. However, there were nuances. Firstly, the girls were neighbors and often entered each other's rooms, so Stephanie might have known about the knife's location under different circumstances. Secondly, no evidence could confirm or refute that the net had been cut with that specific knife. Nonetheless, the judge concluded that Stephanie's initial testimony was not obtained through hypnosis or any other form of manipulation. The trial began in 1988. Stephanie's lawyers continued to argue that her confession was coerced and highlighted the lack of evidence against their client. They emphasized that the lie detection tactics used by Steve Rhodes were not scientifically founded and could not be used in court according to the law. Rhodes claimed that one could tell if someone was lying by observing their eye movements. Furthermore, Stephanie's lawyers presented medical examination results indicating that her cognitive abilities could have been impaired due to the energy pills, making her more susceptible to manipulation like hypnosis. The prosecution argued that Stephanie knew details unknown to investigators at the time of the interrogation, making her testimony credible. They also conducted a court experiment with a psychological sciences doctor attempting to hypnotize her, concluding that it was not possible to induce such a state in her. The victim's relatives also shared interesting information, stating that Steve Rhodes had mentioned Stephanie several times, considering her a problematic person and to some extent fearing her. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and the jury eventually found Stephanie guilty of involuntary manslaughter, sentencing her to 20 years in prison, of which she served 9 before being released on parole. Once freed, Stephanie continued to maintain her innocence and hired lawyers to revisit the case. During their review, the lawyers noticed similarities with another murder committed in 1993. At that time, a man named Charles Crawford attacked a girl who lived 40 minutes away by car from the college Stacy Pannell attended. There were some notable similarities between these two cases. Firstly, the other victim also attended Northeast Mississippi Community College in Boonville. Secondly, the perpetrator entered her home by cutting a hole in the mosquito netting. Stephanie and her lawyers believe that Charles Crawford could be behind Stacy's murder. Crawford was arrested in 1993 and subsequently sentenced to death. The challenge lies in the lack of evidence to prove his guilt in Stacy's case. However, there were significant developments. Stephanie's lawyers discovered that on the wooden rifle found at the crime scene, there was a drop of blood that did not belong to Stacy. DNA analysis of this evidence had not been carried out at the time, as a case review was necessary to proceed with it. Additionally, the victim's underwear was sent to an independent expert, and they were able to extract a DNA sample from an unknown male. This sample has not been added to the FBI's database for comparison with Crawford's DNA because a case review is required for that as well. Moreover, there is no guarantee that the sample found is related to the murder. Supporting the possibility of Crawford's involvement, the lawyers pointed out other facts. Crawford lived near the college at that time, and allegedly, 2 witnesses saw him near the campus a few days before the murder. However, there is no reliable confirmation of this sighting. Despite similarities between the 2 crimes, there are discrepancies. The cut in the mosquito netting was made from inside the room to the outside, which discounts the possibility of an intruder entering from the street. Additionally, Crawford's height was 6 feet and 1 inch, making it unlikely that he could fit through such a small opening. Another contentious point is that the murderer used Stacy's wooden rifle as a weapon. If Crawford had really decided to enter the victim's room and kill her, it is hard to imagine that he would not have brought a weapon with him. Currently, Stephanie and her lawyers are still trying to obtain a case review that would allow comparison of the evidence with Crawford's DNA. Crawford remains on death row, having even spoken with detectives about Stacy's case, but the police could not determine if he was near the college on the night of the murder. You've just witnessed another unfolding story in Unreal True Crime. Lock in your support by subscribing and turning on notifications. Your insight could open the next story. Have a good day. On November 15, 2013, Chris called 911. He said he had arrived home and found his parents unresponsive in their truck. Chris said that Roger was coughing and that Melissa's head was bobbing up and down. He said they were alive but barely moving. The dispatcher asked Chris to put them on their backs to try to administer CPR. Roger and Melissa had both been shot in the right side of their heads. Melissa Blumel died the next day, and Roger Blumel died about 5 weeks later. Roger Blumel was born on January 17, 1965, into a household bustling with many members, including his parents and 7 children, 6 boys and a girl. Roger's family was not only large but also very united, raised with a strong sense of values and community life. Even while still in high school, Roger proved to be a hard-working young man with goals for the future. He began driving his father's truck and, after graduating from the local high school, worked in concrete transportation. Later, he discovered that his true calling was in sales, a field in which he eventually found success. According to his friends, he was one of those people capable of selling ice to Eskimos. This skill was also accompanied by a generous, cheerful, and extroverted personality. He always seemed happy, and nothing pleased him more than making everyone around him have a big smile on their faces. Roger had a good life and an excellent relationship with his family. The only thing missing was a partner, and one day he achieved that too. The details are not specified, but a close friend later recounted that at the end of the evening when he met a young woman who captivated him, Roger declared with absolute resolution that she was the woman he was going to marry. The girl in question was named Melissa. She was born in Wichita on January 1st, 1960. Her childhood, too, was spent in a loving family comprised of 3 girls and 3 boys, though a younger sister died before reaching her first birthday. Melissa was a sweet, hard-working girl, always ready to help not just her family but everyone around her. She began working as a cashier at a bank where she made a successful career. In the following years, her seriousness, commitment, and sense of collaboration earned her several promotions that led her to become the vice president of the bank. That first meeting marked the beginning of the union of 2 soulmates who married in 1991. Life for the Blumels seemed perfect as Melissa climbed the ranks within the bank, and Roger's charm led him to establish his own business. Roger loved to share time with friends and bring joy to everyone around him. In Melissa, he found the perfect companion. Moreover, both had a strong social consciousness that led them to collaborate and participate in any charitable, sports, or collective activity that took place in their community. However, as we've seen in almost all stories, a perfect life does not exist, and for the Blumels, the only thing missing was a child to bring laughter and joy to their loving home. Unfortunately, this desire remained elusive for the couple, and after years of unsuccessfully trying to conceive, Roger and Melissa began to consider the idea of adopting a child. With this intention, they contacted a local social worker. Their wishes were heard, and doubly so, as a woman named Keisha Schaberg had put up her 2 sons for adoption. Anthony, 7 years old, whom everyone called Tony, and Christopher, 4 years old, known as Chris. Keisha's idea was to place them in an open adoption so she could maintain contact with her sons and the family raising them. However, the Blumels did not consider this the best option, as they wanted to raise the children as their own and completely remove them from what had been a tough start in life. In the end, Roger and Melissa's approach prevailed, and from that moment, Tony and Chris formally became part of the Blumel family, starting to enjoy a life they never knew existed. In fact, it was later known that Tony was amazed he was allowed to have dinner every day. The children quickly adapted and began to enjoy their new life. They attended elementary school and successfully completed that stage as good students. In high school, they were also successful, had no problems with their peers, were fully integrated and made a wide group of friends, and excelled in sports, particularly in wrestling and football. Tony made rapid progress in wrestling, securing second place in a competition in his division. At that time, everything seemed to promise a bright future for the boys and a happy life for the whole family. But the Blumels' world began to turn upside down when Tony reached his senior year of high school. The young man began to change what had until then been exemplary behavior. He turned into someone who was constantly in conflict with his parents, accusing them of always favoring his younger brother Chris. From then on, he engaged in alcohol consumption, disregarded curfews, and even smoked marijuana. Things in the Blumel household became chaotic, and soon it seemed that the last hope for the young man to correct his path was lost. For a long time, Tony had expressed a fervent desire to join the United States Air Force after finishing high school. But this dream dissipated due to his own behavior when, in 2013, he was arrested for an unspecified act of aggression, and shortly after graduating, again for driving under the influence of alcohol. With these records, he could say goodbye to a future in military aviation. These events did not lead Tony to reflect. On the contrary, it plunged him into a downward spiral. Once he graduated from high school, his life had no direction. He did not want to continue studying, nor did he want to work. In fact, he wanted to do nothing more than sleep late and spend the rest of his day immersed in a cloud of cannabis smoke. Melissa lived in terror of the boy's outbursts of rage. And amidst all this situation, which was so difficult to bear, there was something else that the Blumels did not know. Since the spring of 2013, through social media, Keisha had been contacting her biological sons. While it seems Chris either rejected Keisha's friend request or was not very receptive to communicating with his biological mother, Tony not only accepted immediately, but was also completely excited to reconnect with his real mother. Keisha had been devastated after giving her sons to the Blumels. Although she was relieved to know that both had been welcomed into the same good family and would stay together, she could not resign herself to the lack of contact. Reconnecting with her eldest son filled Keisha with excitement, but at the same time she developed a great resentment towards the Blumels, believing that they had turned Chris against her. However, this feeling was undoubtedly overshadowed by the happiness of reconnecting with her firstborn. Additionally, the news of Tony's problems with his adoptive parents fueled Keisha's hope of reuniting with her son, and she wasted no time in offering him to come to see her. Meanwhile, at the adoptive family's home, far from improving, things were getting worse. The conflict reached a point of no return when one day, in the midst of one of his fits of rage, Tony punched a hole in a wall. This was the turning point for the Blumels. They could no longer risk their own safety and that of Chris. After several unsuccessful discussions trying to put an end to the eldest son's behaviors, Roger and Melissa came to the difficult decision to tell Tony that he had to leave the house. The young man initially wandered aimlessly but soon realized he had to do something to sustain himself, so he got some jobs at fast food restaurants and supplemented those meager earnings by selling cannabis. Although he slept like a nomad from night to night at some friends' houses, he ended up associating with a group of youths who were deeply involved in excessive drug use. And amid all these despairing events, a lifeline suddenly appeared for Tony when Keisha told him to come to California to live with her. Tony eagerly accepted the invitation, and the reunion took place in September 2013 at Keisha's house in California. The young man was accompanied by his best friend from high school, Braden, who had dropped out in his junior year to dedicate himself to drug dealing. The two young men were excited because they arrived with the hope of having Keisha's support, who was also versed in the drug trade, to start a large marijuana business in the area, and they even talked about entering the medical cannabis market. The reality was that the two young men had arrived to live in a small apartment which had only one room. It is not hard to imagine that the situation in the place began to be tense, particularly because Sean, Keisha's partner, had 2 jobs and was the only one bringing in money to cover the expenses for 5 people. Keisha only contributed a part of the social assistance she received for her daughter. Keisha, Tony, and Braden spent their days using drugs, and the woman's younger daughter was all the time under that bad influence. Logically, at one point things reached an unacceptable limit, something that happened when Sean found out that Tony and Braden were selling marijuana near her house. She let them know that what they were doing was simply unacceptable and dangerous for her as the property owner. Consequently, she told them to take their drugs elsewhere. Additionally, after this episode, Sean gave an ultimatum to the house occupants. Everyone had to get a job or leave the apartment. Far from making the group reflect, as was her intention, what it achieved was that they formed an alliance to show indignation towards her. They decided to leave the apartment and go to a nearby hotel for 2 weeks. But that was not the solution either, because Without having an income, after those weeks they had no means to sustain the hotel payment. The need for money did not make them consider working decently. The first idea they had was to return to Kansas, perhaps because it was familiar territory for Tony in terms of drug dealing. After almost a day on the road, the group decided to stop in Arizona and spend the night at a hotel. It was there that Tony told his travel companions that he had come up with an idea, which was to end the lives of his adoptive parents to claim the inheritance. Once they arrived in Wichita and found accommodation at a hotel they rented for a month, they dedicated themselves to refining the details of that idea. It was a simple solution. They had to end the lives of Roger and Melissa, claim the insurance, sell the assets, and use the resources to start a new, larger-scale drug business. Tony was convinced that the original family, which he had returned to, would become rich by cultivating and selling marijuana. Tony even proposed a perfect day to carry out the crime. It would be Friday, November 15th of that year, 2013, as his brother Chris would not be at home, as he had to attend an event related to his wrestling practice. Tony had been a star in that discipline and still maintained contact with some team members, which is how he learned about his brother's commitment that night. Gradually, the plan was formed, in which Tony would communicate with Roger and Melissa and invite them somewhere with the excuse of talking about what had happened between them and trying to fix things. Tony's idea was that, while there was no one at home, Braden would take Keisha to the residence so she could enter and steal some valuables. Tony also knew where his adoptive parents kept a significant amount of money for emergencies. The idea was that the act would appear to be a robbery gone wrong. But from the beginning, the final intention was clear. When Roger and Melissa returned home, Keisha would end their lives. Everyone thought it was an excellent plan, but later, Braden backed out. He did not want to participate in the act, but agreed to help by acquiring the guns they would need. As a substitute, he recommended a friend of his, also a former high school peer named Andrew, who could take on the role as the driver to take Keisha to the Blumels' residence. As promised, Braden procured 2 pistols purchased from other criminals. It should be mentioned that there was never any intention to share the money with Andrew, who was agreed to be paid $1,000 to act essentially as a driver and support for Keisha in the robbery. In the end, she would be the executor. In early November, Keisha posted on her social networks a photo of her with Tony and a caption that read, "A bond that cannot be broken." Finally, the day arrived. It was Friday, November 15th, 2013, and as Tony had predicted, his wonderful adoptive parents did not refuse to meet with him. The meeting went peacefully. While at the Blumels' house, the scene was completely different. As soon as Roger and Melissa left for the meeting, Keisha and Andrew entered the house, forced the garage door, and began to rummage through everything. They took the opportunity to take some small, valuable items and the cash the couple kept in the house for any eventuality. Once the first part of the plan was carried out, Keisha and Andrew hid beside the secluded residence to wait for their victims to arrive. They soon received a call from Tony, informing them that the meeting had ended, that his adoptive parents had dropped him off at the hotel, and they were on their way home. The wait was not too long. As soon as the Blumels' vehicle stopped in front of the parking gate, the 2 attackers came out of their hiding place. Keisha immediately positioned herself on Melissa's side, while Andrew aimed at Roger to keep him still. Melissa, still surprised, recognized the mother of the children they had adopted more than 10 years ago to provide love, stability, and a better future. She only managed to say, "Oh my God, Keisha," when a precise shot to the head made her collapse in the seat. Roger, completely disconcerted, tried to assist his wife. Meanwhile, Keisha reached the man's window and pulled the trigger towards Roger's head, but the gun jammed. The woman made several attempts to shoot while he was frozen, with the slumped body of his wife next to him. Finally, the gun fired, and Roger also collapsed next to the one who had been the best partner for his life project. Once the fatal plan was carried out, Keisha and Andrew boarded the vehicle they had arrived in and quickly left. The Blumel spouses remained there until around 9:15 p.m., when Chris returned from his meeting and found the terrible scene. He immediately called 911, reporting that he had just arrived home and found his parents practically unconscious inside their van. The young man stated that Roger was coughing and that Melissa was bobbing her head up and down. Both had gunshot marks on their heads. The dispatcher instructed him to try resuscitation maneuvers while emergency services arrived a few minutes later and took over the situation. Miraculously, the Blumels were still alive, but their lives were hanging by a thread, so they were immediately transported to a hospital. While all this was happening, upon returning to the hotel where they were staying, Keisha seemed to have a panic attack and stated that all she needed was to consume some illicit substance, and she did so accompanied by the other boys. Also, at that moment, Keisha handed over the used gun and a wallet of Melissa's that she had stolen from the house to be disposed of in a nearby stream. Andrew threw the items into the pond of a nearby park. The following day, Tony began using the money stolen from his adoptive parents' home to start trafficking marijuana, earning his first $100. Unfortunately, that same day, Melissa lost her battle and passed away at the age of 53. Tony also went to the hospital to see his father, but what he did not know is that sometime before, he had been removed from both the Blumels' will and their insurance policies. Consequently, the two heinous crimes had been committed in vain. In the following days, it was also discovered that Andrew had not been paid and was even unaware that Keisha had taken cash from the Blumel family's home. Eventually, fate caught up with them. In the initial inspections of the Blumel residence, the police noticed that the garage door had been forced open, and inside the home everything was in disarray. There were items scattered everywhere. It was confirmed that money, jewelry, and other items had been stolen. The authorities wondered if the attack on the spouses had been a result of them arriving while the thieves were still in the house. However, the fatal assault had occurred before the couple entered the home, so this initial hypothesis was dismissed. In the van where Roger and Melissa were attacked, there were no significant fingerprints, although investigators did find a bullet casing. Then, the authorities turned their attention towards the victims' workplaces, thinking perhaps an upset client had sought revenge. But this theory was also discarded, so it was time to talk to people close to the couple. The first on the detectives' list was Tony, as he had been the last person seen alive with the victims. But the young man insisted he knew nothing and had not participated in the act. According to him, after finishing dinner, he had gone straight back to the hotel where he was staying with his mother. This information was confirmed by the staff at the tolls. The second on the list was Chris, who had found the bodies, but he was quickly dismissed after verifying his statement that at the time of the incident, he was at a dinner with members of the wrestling team. However, the investigators found something strange in the young man's behavior. He didn't seem overly disturbed and instead appeared to be lost in thought. When the police pursued this direction and asked him what he thought had happened to his parents, Chris immediately replied that there was only one person who came to mind. He added that the only one who might hold any grudge against their parents, and perhaps be capable of such an act, was his older brother, Tony. With this significant lead, the authorities got a lucky break in their search for the culprits. A man contacted the police to say that a young man who was a friend of Tony had approached him intending to buy a gun. The detectives focused on this individual, and upon checking his background found he had a long history related to drugs. Moreover, they discovered he had traveled to California along with Tony. It was Braden. Sooner rather than later, Braden received a message from his family informing him that the sheriff's office investigators were looking to interrogate him about what had happened to the Blumels. The morning after receiving this information, Braden went to the police station. A press report states that on his way to the police station, he stopped by a pond to throw away something, apparently the guns used in the crime, which had not been disposed of as planned. According to this account, he was already under surveillance, and when the police searched the water, they found in the bag he threw a pistol that had not been fired in the attack. Braden's interrogation lasted for 3 days. At first, the young man maintained he had nothing to do with the incident, but he couldn't withstand the pressure from the authorities and ended up confessing everything he knew, stating that the idea for the attack had been Tony's. Tony Blumel, 18 years old, and his biological mother, Keisha, 35, were arrested on November 19th at the hotel where they were staying. Additionally, Andrew, then 18 years old, was arrested. And finally, Braden, also 18, was put behind bars on November 20th of that same year, 2013. At that time, Keisha did not admit her participation in the robbery and other crimes, although the 3 young men confessed what had happened. On November 25th, 2013, the accused made their first appearance before the court via video conference. On that occasion, they were all charged with the same offenses: first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, 2 counts of aggravated robbery, burglary, and theft. The 3 young men were set a bail of $500,000, and for Keisha, the bail was set at $1 million. On December 21st, Roger's heart stopped beating, and at 48 years old, he joined his beloved Melissa. And after Roger's death, the situation for the woman and the 3 young men worsened, as they could be charged with capital murder, which could imply a death penalty sentence. Indeed, on January 3, 2014, the 4 detainees were formally charged with a count of capital murder for being the alleged perpetrators of the death of more than 1 person in the same incident. Additionally, Keisha was charged with 2 counts of aggravated robbery, 1 count of burglary, and 1 count of theft. The preliminary hearing took place on July 17th of that same year. By that time, Braden had negotiated with the authorities, and in exchange for a benefit in his sentence, he ended up becoming the prosecution's star witness. After a year of negotiations, not only did Braden reach an agreement, but 2 other individuals involved in the crime also negotiated with the prosecution. According to the agreements reached, the accused would not dispute the charges against them and would waive their right to appeal their sentences. In exchange, the prosecution agreed not to seek the death penalty and to drop some charges. Starting in mid-2015, in separate hearings, each confirmed their decision to plead guilty. The judge sentenced Keisha to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the capital murder charge, and additionally to 122 months in prison for 2 counts of aggravated robbery. The sentences would be served consecutively. In her opportunity to speak, she stated she deeply regretted what had happened and lamented everything the Blumel family had to go through. The rest of her statement was controversial, as she claimed she had nothing to do with the incident, having no anger towards the Blumels. On the contrary, she had the utmost respect for them, as they had given Tony and Chris a wonderful life, and she would always be grateful for that. According to official records to this day, Keisha remains detained in a high-security level correctional facility. The second to face his fate was her son, Anthony Blumel, known to everyone as Tony, who received the same sentence as his mother. During the sentencing hearing, Tony, who declined to speak when given the opportunity, heard the victim impact statement made by his aunt, Christina Blumel, who thanked the authorities for administering justice and referred to all the love that Roger and Melissa had given the boy. In complete silence, Tony listened to Christina's heartfelt words, and at one moment, tears almost sprang from the young criminal's eyes. In the end, the woman told Tony that he had chosen his path without anyone forcing him to make those decisions. She added that perhaps one day he might understand his choices, or perhaps he never would. Tony has been since then in a correctional facility. His record up to this moment listed a significant number of prison infractions related to smuggling, fights, unauthorized phone use, explicit sex, theft, and disobedience, among others. A week after these sentences, it was Andrew's turn, the only one who did not agree to acknowledge his responsibility and was found guilty of first and second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, plus 155 months. Finally, Braden, the last of the participants in the incident and who from the beginning had reached an agreement with the prosecution, was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 24.5 years in prison. According to his official record, his first opportunity for release will be on May 28, 2035. However, his prison record shows that far from reforming, Braden had received 71 disciplinary reports for disobedience, threats to others, stimulant use, intoxication, possession of tobacco contraband, theft, and dangerous smuggling, among other causes. In the end, the district attorney expressed satisfaction with the outcome of this case. It's worth noting that even though she had waived that right, Keisha attempted to appeal her sentences unsuccessfully. At the end of this story, only one thing remains undisputed. The lives of two wonderful people, Roger and Melissa Blumel, were cut short with a terrible and unnecessary ending. The bitterness, or perhaps the guilt of a woman who led a life of excess for which she gave up her children for adoption, was the genesis of the tragedy. She couldn't bear that one of her descendants wanted nothing more to do with her, which apparently led her to direct her anger at the people who gave all their love and well-being to her children. For his part, Tony repaid all the love and care received from that couple with resentment, envy, and violence, resorting to an unjustifiable path of substance abuse, and finally, a double crime. Keisha's younger daughter ended up being sent to a foster home. As for Chris Blumel, he managed to overcome what happened and has led a good life with the support of the family. And well, dear audience, that concludes today's case. Before you go, leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Don't forget to share this video if you think someone you know might be interested. See you in another episode of Unreal True Crime. Goodbye.